All right, guys, so up to this point, we have our back end done. That's pretty much set off to the side for now. And we created basically just a very simple React component where we have one shopping list component. I mean, we have our app navbar, but that's just stateless, doesn't really have anything to do with anything besides just showing it. So what I want to do is implement Redux so we can create a separate component. Instead of having this just prompt embedded in our shopping list component, I want to have an item modal component, and I want that to interact with our Redux state. So this video is probably, let me just go back to VS Code. This one's probably going to be one of the toughest ones to make because of the Redux boilerplate, which I just can't stand. There's so much to it, like just getting it set up. Once you're familiar with Redux, you probably want to have just some pre-made boilerplate that you use and you just add to your application rather than typing it all out. Now, if you know nothing about Redux at all, I'd suggest watching my Redux crash course because I'll go more into depth in that video as to what everything is and you know a little bit of theory around Redux and stuff. This is more of just a hands-on project series, so I will explain things as I move along, but I'm not going to deep dive into Redux. Basically, it's just our state manager. It's where we want our data to be kept in our front end. Obviously, when we implement our back end, it'll come from the database. It'll come from that API and then into our Redux store and then ultimately into our React application. But for now, we're just going to have some static data in the Redux store. So enough talk, let's get started. So I'm going to install a couple things. I'll leave the server running and just go to open up a new terminal. And we want to make sure that we're in the client. Okay, right now I'm inside the server. I want to go in the client folder, which is our React folder. So let's cd into client. Okay, very important that you do that. You don't want to install Redux on your node server. So let's do npm install I. We're going to install Redux. We're going to install React-Redux, which is what binds the two together. A lot of people think Redux is like part of React or was made with React, but it's a completely separate thing that you can actually use with other frameworks or you can use by itself. However, React Redux is what binds the two together. We also want a piece of middleware called Redux Thunk, and we're not going to really need this until we deal with our backend because it just gives us a different way to dispatch from our actions to our reducer when we want to make asynchronous calls to our server. But for now, we're not dealing with the server. That will come in a little while, but we still want to install it now. All right, so those are the three things you want to install. Again, it should be in your client. So when you go in your client folder and you go in your package.json, that's where this stuff should show up. Okay. All right, so now that we have that installed, let's go ahead and in our source, in our client folder, in our source, we want to create a file called store.js. Okay, so this is like the entry point to our Redux store. And if you want to kind of look this stuff up, Redux has some pretty good documentation. It's a little confusing, but let's see, store. So store holds the whole state tree of your application. The only way to change the state inside it is to dispatch an action to it. Okay, so we have our store, we have actions for when we want to do things like get items, add item, delete item, things like that. And then the reducer, which will take care of basically doing stuff to our front end application, like removing the item or adding the item, stuff like that. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code and let's import a bunch of stuff from Redux. So we want create store. We want apply middleware because we are using Thunk, which is a piece of middleware that we need to bring in. So we need to kind of wrap that in this apply middleware function. And then this compose, because we're going to be using the Redux tools, and to use that along with the apply middleware, we need to wrap it in this compose function. So this all comes from Redux. All right, now we also want to import Thunk, and that's going to be from Redux-Thunk And we also want our root reducer. So we haven't created that yet, but I'm still going to bring it in because we will create it. So import root reducer from, and it's going to be in a folder called reducers. And I'm going to call it index.js, so we don't have to do like this. Since it's called index.js, we can just leave it like that. So those are our imports. Next, we want a variable representing our initial state. So our initial state is going to just be an empty object. And then we want, what I like to do is create a variable for the middleware and put any middleware that we're going to use inside of an array. In this case, we just have thunk. Okay, then we want to create our store variable and set that to create store, which we brought in above. And this create store it's going to take in three things. It's going to take in the root reducer. It's going to take in our initial state, and then it would also take in any middleware. So we would put like apply middleware. But since we're using Redux tools, we want to wrap the apply middleware in this compose function. Okay, or we want to pass it in to this compose. So let's do apply middleware. And instead of just putting in thunk, since I put the middleware into this array here, into this variable, I'm just going to use the spread operator and say middleware like that. All right, now in order to use the Redux dev tools, we have to put a line of code in here. And I'll show you real quick. If we go to our application and we try to open up the Redux dev tools, we're going to get an error message here that says no store found. Make sure you follow these instructions. If I click on that link, it's going to take us to this page. What we need to add is this line right here, this window.__ Redux DevTools extension, and then the same thing with a set of parentheses at the end. So it looks kind of weird, but that's what we need to put in our application for it to be able to work how we want. So we're going to grab that, paste it in. If you don't want to visit that page, just go ahead and copy this in. Just make sure you do it correctly. All right, and then we finally just want to export our store. So export default store. And that's it for this file. Okay, we shouldn't have to touch this again at all. Now, let's see. In order to integrate the store into our application, we need to go into app.js, and we need to bring in what's called the provider. And this is from React Redux. Okay, React Redux is the package that basically binds them together. So we're going to import provider from, and if you've worked with Redux at all, you guys probably have seen this stuff before, but this comes from React Redux. And then we also want to import our store file that we just created. So store, remember we exported default store, so we want to import that from that file, which is just store. Okay, now in order to use Redux in our components, in order to get the stuff from the state and put it into component properties, things like that, we have to wrap everything in that provider. So I'm going to go right above this div and I'm going to put in provider, and that takes in a property of our store like that. Okay, and we have to end that, put the end tag down here of provider. All right, so now we should be able to basically access stuff from our state from our components. Okay, so we can share state throughout our components. This provides it. So let's save that. And now what I'm going to do is, let's see, what do we want to do next? We're going to have a root reducer. So let's create inside the source folder, not in the components, but just right in the source. We want to create a folder called reducers. And we're going to have our root reducer, which is going to be a file called index.js. Now, the main point of this root reducer is just to bring together all of our other reducers. Now, this is a simple application. All we have is an item reducer. An item is really the only resource we have. But if we were to add like authentication later on, we might want an auth reducer. We might want an error reducer. If we wanted to add, I don't know, to-dos or something, we could do a to-do reducer. So the point of this is it's like a meeting place for all of them. So what we want to do is import something called combine reducers, and that comes from Redux. Okay, so we want to bring that in, and we also want to bring in any reducer. Actually don't want that. Any reducer that we're going to use, which in our case is just the one item. The hell, import reducer should be item reducer, and that's going to be from /item reducer, which we haven't actually created yet, but we will. And then all we have to do is export default, and we want to export this combine reducers, and then just pass in an object with the different reducers. So I want this to be called item. This is how we're going to identify it from within components when we want to use it, and then just set it to item reducer. What did I do? Oh, I spelled default wrong. All right, so if we had like an auth reducer, we would import that, and then we would add it here like auth reducer, and so on. Okay, and you can have as many reducers as you want. So let's save that, and that's all we should have, that's all we have to do for now. So we'll close that. And now let's create our item reducer. So item reducer.js. Okay, so a reducer is where our actual state is going to go. And this is where we check our actions. Okay, we're going to have an actions file that will have like the get items action, the add items action, and it's going to dispatch to our reducer, and it can send along a payload if it wants. So if we were to fetch data from our server for, let's say, get items, we would then dispatch to the reducer, and we would send that response we get from our server to the reducer. Okay, and then we would do what we want with it, which would be to add it to React, to our component. So what I'm going to do here is let's just create our initial state, and this is going to be an object. Okay, our state is an object, and it's going to have an items array. Okay, and this looks familiar because right now we have this stored in the shopping list component, which we don't want it in here anymore. I'm going to just grab this. I'm not going to delete it just yet, but I'm going to copy it, and then I'll just go like that. Okay, so now it's in here, and since we're using this UUID, I'm just going to import that so that it doesn't give us an error. And ultimately, we're not going to have this stuff here. It's going to come from our back end. But for now, you can see what I'm doing is I'm just moving the static data from the component to the reducer. Now, in our reducer, we need to evaluate action types. So we need to create some types. So any action that we have, like get items, add item, delete item, we want to have types for. So what I like to do is create a folder called actions. And notice I haven't touched any of our components, any of our code that we wrote earlier. I haven't touched any of that. We're just adding stuff. We're setting up the Redux boilerplate. So in actions, we're going to have a file called types.js. Okay, and the types, sometimes this will be called constants, and that's what they are. They're just constants. They're variables that are set to strings that we export. So let's say export const, we'll have get underscore items, and it's going to be set to a string of get underscore items. And then let's do two more. So we'll also have add item. Basically anything you're going to do in your application, you're probably going to have an action type for. So add item, let's do delete item. And it's just set to a string that's pretty much the same, or that is the exact same as the variable name. This should be delete item because we're only deleting one. All right, so now that we have these types, we can close this up, and we want to bring this into our item reducer. We want to bring these types in. All right, so what we'll do is just go right here, and we'll import get underscore items. Let's do add underscore item. Let's do delete underscore item. And it's going to be from our types file, which is up one directory in actions, whoops, not store, actions, and then types. Okay, now in our reducer, we're going to have a switch statement because we basically, whoops, actually this needs to be in a function. So we want to export default function, and then this function actually takes two parameters. One is going to be the state. So we're going to say state, and then we're going to set that equal to our initial state variable above, which includes the items. And it also takes in an action. Okay, this action is going to have, this is an object, and it'll have a type. Okay, it'll have a type attached to it, which is going to come from the actions file, which we haven't created yet. And I know this, if you haven't really worked with Redux, this stuff sounds very confusing, but once you see it all come together, you'll get a better idea of what's going on. That's why I said I hate teaching it. I hate the boilerplate, because while you're typing it out, it's friggin' confusing. So we want to create a switch here, and when this action comes in, we want to run a test on the type. So remember, it's an object, so we can access the type with action.type. And then what we want to check for is things like getItems. Okay, so this is going to be, actually I want to put case here. So a JavaScript switch, we want to say case and then the getItems. And then all I'm going to do for now is I'm going to say return, and what we're returning is the state. And I'm just going to put the spread operator in here, and what this is going to do is return whatever is in here. Okay, and I'm doing this for a reason, because when we fetch from the API, we're going to change this up a little, but for now it's just going to fetch this. Okay, it's just going to fetch this hard-coded data. So I'll do getItems, and then the only other thing I'm going to do right now is the default, which is just to return the state. So return state, okay, which is this here, which is set to initial state, which is this. Okay, so it's just going to return eggs, milk, steak, and water. All right, so I think that's all I want to do for now in the reducer. So I'm going to save this. My goal is to get our shopping list component displaying these items instead of just what's embedded in the component. Okay, once we do that, I think that things will start to get a little easier. So in order to do that, we need an action, okay? Because if we look in our component, let's look in our shopping list component, we just have the stuff embedded in the state here, and I don't want that. So we want an action. So I'm going to go into my actions folder and create a file called item action.js, or item actions, plural. And this is where our actions go. This is where we'll actually make our request to the back end, but we're not getting to that just yet. So we want to import our types here as well. So I'll just copy them from the reducer. So I'll grab this and paste that in, except now we just need /types because it's actually in the same folder. And then I'm going to use arrow functions. I mean, you could do like function get items, you could do that, but I'm actually going to do, and you'll probably see this more often, is const or export. Sorry, I should have did export for that function too, but export const get items, and then we want to put equals and then whatever parameters. In this case, it doesn't take any, and then an arrow function. All right, and then what I'm going to do is return to the reducer the type of get items. Okay, so if I save this, basically this return, it's going to our item reducer and it's checking action.type. Okay, you see how we have type? This is the action. Now we could put anything in here. We could do test in something, and in our reducer we could access action.test. We usually, if we're sending something, we would put a payload like that and put whatever the response from the server, and that would be action.payload. But in this case, we're not actually fetching from the server just yet. All we're doing is sending the type. And when it hits the reducer, when this getItems hits, we're just going to return this. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So I don't think there's anything else we need to add in here just yet. So what we want to do now is we want to call this getItems from within our component instead of having it in the state. So I'm going to just completely get rid of this state here, because now we want it to come from our Redux reducer, our item reducer. Now, in order to do that, we have to do a couple things in this component. So we need to import what's called connect. Okay, now connect comes from React Redux, and it allows us to basically to get state from Redux into React, into a React component. And we're also going to want to import that getItems action. So let's say import getItems. And what I'm talking about is this here, this getItems function. We want to import that, and that's inside the actions folder in the item actions file. So let's say from, and we want to go up one into actions and into item actions. Okay, now when we use connect like this, what we have to do is, instead of exporting the actual class of the component, we want to export connect, and then we want to set a parentheses and then another set of parentheses that wraps the actual component name like that. Okay, and then this connect is basically, it's going to take in two things in this situation. It's going to take a function called map state to props, which we haven't created yet. We're actually going to create this function. Next, it's going to take in any actions that we want to use, in this case getItems, okay, which we brought in above. Now this map state to props, what this does is it allows us to take our item state, in this case this is our state, and we want to basically turn this or map this into a component property so that we can use it in ShoppingList. So we want to be able to use it as this.props.items. Okay, so to create that function, we'll just do that right here. We'll say const map state to props, and we're going to just use an arrow function. It takes in, we could put parentheses here, takes in a parameter of state, and then we want to set this to a set of parentheses and then pass in an object. Okay, and in this object we want to set item, and we want to set this to state.item. And we're using item because that's what we called the reducer. If we look in our root reducer right here, we set this to item. All right, if I set it to post, then we would call it post or whatever. So back in our ShoppingList component, we're almost done here. One thing that we should do is add our prop types. So we want to bring in prop types up here, and this isn't actually Redux. Prop types is just part of React. Whenever you have component properties, you should put them inside of prop types, which basically is kind of a form of validation. So we're going to import prop types from prop-types, and then down underneath our class, under the ShoppingList class, or a component, whatever you want to call it, we want to do the name of it, which is ShoppingList, the name of the class, dot prop types, so lowercase p prop type, whoops, should be lowercase p prop types. And then we want to set this to a set of curly braces, and then we basically have two props in this component. We have getItems, which is actually going to be a prop. This action that we brought in, getItems, okay, we brought it in up here. When you bring in an action from Redux, it's going to be stored as a prop. Okay, so it'll be this.props.getItems. So we want to add that to our prop types. So we'll say getItems, and we basically just want to set it to prop types dot and then func, because it is a function. You want to put the type. That's the whole point of prop types, is to set the type, which is a function. We also want to say it is required. All right, and then the other prop that we want is item, and we're going to set that to prop types dot, and then this is going to be an object. Okay, this represents our state, which is an object. So let's say is required. Okay. And when I say it represents our state, it is a prop, but we're mapping it. We're mapping it from the state. Okay, so we're mapping the Redux state to a component property. And I hope this is coming across, you guys. It's really hard to explain. So the only thing left to do now is run getItems, because once we run it, it will send the action type to the it'll dispatch that to the reducer, and then it should just basically return our state. It should return what's up here and bring it into our component. So the way that we want to run that is within a lifecycle method called component did mount. So React has these lifecycle methods that run at certain points. This one runs when the component mounts. That's usually when you want to, if you're making an API request or anything like that, if you're calling an action, this is where you want to do it. So we can simply say this.props.getItems, and that should call it. So now, the moment of truth, we'll go ahead and save this. Let me just go back to our server here, make sure, and don't mind these when it says is defined but never used, just because we define these types, these action types, and we haven't used them yet. So let's see if, let's go back to Chrome and see if the state is actually showing, which it's not. Cannot read items of null, and the reason for that is because if we look in our render, we're still trying to pull the items out of the component state. When we say this.state, this refers to what we used to have here, the component state. But what we've done is we've gotten rid of the component state, and we're now taking the state from our reducer, from our store, and we mapped them to props. Okay, we did that here. We set it to this item prop. So the way that we would access the items is by saying, let me just go right here, is by saying this.props.item.items, which looks a little funny, but item actually represents the entire state object. Items is the array inside the state. If we look at our reducer, item represents this whole thing. Items is the actual array. So what we could do, instead of having to type this stuff out down here, is we'll just use destructuring like we did right here. So we'll say this.props.item. Okay, so this is now where our state lives in Redux, and we're pulling it out. We're pulling out items from it. So now if I save that and we go back to Chrome, there we go. So now it's displaying it. You can see in our Redux dev tools, it called getItems. If we look in our state, you can see we have the item. This is basically our reducer, our item state, and then the items array that holds everything, all these items here. All right, and just to make sure, we can see the last one is water, and if we go to our reducer, the last one is water. I'm going to change it to candy and save and go back to Chrome, and now we should see that change. And you can now see that it's coming from Redux as opposed to just right in that component. That means that we can access the state from any other component that we create. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, if I click one, if I try to delete, you'll see it cannot read items of null because, let me just reload this. In our delete, okay, this is something we're going to have to change. When we click, let's see, where is it? This is, no, that's the add button. When we click the delete button, we're still looking in state.items, and then we're calling filter on state.items, which doesn't even exist anymore. It's null. Same thing if we try to add, it's going to try to set the state of the local component. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to kind of, first of all, we're going to make it so that we have a delete action so that we can then dispatch to the reducer and have our delete item and get rid of whatever one we delete. We also want to create a whole new component to add an item. We don't want to use this prompt here. We want to create a nice modal that that will display, and we can interact with our Redux state, okay, with the item reducer through that component, and then add it, and it'll still show up here in the shopping list component. Okay, so I think that's going to be it for this video, guys. I'm sorry if it was a little confusing. It's just a little hard to explain, but in the next video, things should start to make a little more sense.